It began in the winter, when the future of America was already dying. Snow swallowed the roads, the rivers froze into glass, and the dream of independence, barely born, was already collapsing under hunger, cold, and despair. Men deserted by the dozens, muskets rusted, boots disintegrated. Entire regiments wrapped their bleeding feet in rags torn from blankets meant to keep them alive at night. George Washington, commander of a failing army, stood at the edge of extinction. And the man who would save everything was not a general, not a politician, not even a soldier by training. He was a poor, overweight, self-educated bookseller from Boston. His name was Henry Knox. At the time, almost no one believed he mattered. History would later prove that without him, the American Revolution would have ended in silence. Henry Knox was born in 1750 in Boston, a British colony that had no idea it was quietly raising one of the most important minds of the coming revolution. His father was a ship captain who vanished overseas and never returned. His mother struggled to keep the family alive. At 12 years old, an age when other boys were still playing games, Henry left school forever. There was no formal education waiting for him. There was only work. He became an apprentice in a small bookstore, stacking volumes for wealthy men who debated philosophy, while the boy listened in silence. Henry could not afford tutors, so he taught himself. He read everything: history, mathematics, engineering, military theory. He devoured books not meant for someone of his class. Most dangerous of all, he fell in love with artillery. Cannons, mortars, the brutal mathematics of force. At night, after the shop closed, Henry studied diagrams of fortifications and siege engines. He memorized the writings of European military engineers. He sketched cannon designs by candlelight. No one told him to stop. No one paid attention. He was invisible. Until the war came. When British troops fired into a Boston crowd in 1770, killing civilians in what would become known as the Boston Massacre, Henry Knox was standing nearby. He saw the blood on the snow. He heard the screams, and something hardened inside him. When protests turned into rebellion, and rebellion turned into open war, Knox did something astonishing. He walked straight up to George Washington. Washington was already a legend, tall, controlled, distant. Knox was none of those things. He was heavy-set, awkward, poorly dressed, barely 30. He had never commanded troops in battle. But when he spoke about artillery, Washington listened. Knox did not speak like a dreamer. He spoke like a man who had already solved problems no one else even understood. Washington made a decision that would alter the fate of a continent. He put Henry Knox in charge of the Continental Army's artillery. It was a ridiculous appointment. The army barely had guns, and the guns they did have were useless. By the end of 1775, the American Revolution was on the verge of failure. The British still controlled Boston. Their cannons dominated the harbor. The Continental Army had no heavy artillery capable of forcing them out. Worse, enlistments were expiring. Soldiers planned to go home. Winter was closing in. Then Knox proposed something that sounded insane. He suggested retrieving the massive cannons captured months earlier at Fort Ticonderoga, over 300 miles away, deep in frozen wilderness, and dragging them across mountains, forests, and rivers in the dead of winter. These were not small weapons. Some weighed over 2 tons. No modern roads, no engines, no guarantees. If the mission failed, the revolution was over. Washington said yes. Henry Knox left immediately. What followed became one of the greatest logistical achievements in American history, and almost no one today can tell you how it happened. Knox assembled teams of farmers, oxen, sleds, ropes, and raw courage. He moved the cannons inch by inch through snowdrifts taller than men. Rivers cracked beneath the weight, sleds shattered, cannons slipped, nearly killing the men hauling them. At one point, an entire cannon fell through river ice and vanished beneath freezing water. Knox refused to abandon it. Men stripped, dove into the river, tied ropes, and hauled the iron monster back out. Fingers froze, toes blackened. Some men never fully recovered. Knox recorded it all calmly, methodically, as if he were moving books instead of weapons that could change history. After 56 days, against all odds, he delivered the artillery to Washington. When those cannons were finally positioned on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston, the British woke to an impossible sight. They were trapped. Within days, the British evacuated the city. The Revolution lived, and Henry Knox had just saved it. But this was only the beginning. Knox would go on to shape American military doctrine, oversee artillery in every major campaign, and become one of Washington's closest confidants. He fought at Trenton, at Princeton, at Yorktown. He stood beside Washington at the victory that ended British rule. When the war ended, Knox could have faded into obscurity. Instead, he helped build the nation itself. As America's first Secretary of War, Knox faced a terrifying reality. The new country was fragile, poor, and surrounded by enemies. The army was disbanding. States distrusted each other. Native nations stood in the path of westward expansion. Knox tried, often unsuccessfully, to argue for restraint, treaties, and moral responsibility. He warned that endless frontier violence would poison the Republic. He was ignored. History rarely listens to the men who understand consequences. Henry Knox died in 1806, not on a battlefield, not in glory, but quietly, financially ruined, overweight, and largely forgotten. Today, his name survives mostly in places. Fort Knox, Knox County. Streets and towns no one connects to the man himself. Yet without him, the American Revolution collapses. No cannons, no Boston victory, no momentum, no United States. A nation rose because a poor boy read books no one expected him to read and dragged impossible weight across frozen land when everyone else had given up. And that is only the part history allows us to remember. Because what happened next, after victory, after power, after Washington, reveals a far darker truth about the country Henry Knox helped create. Victory did not bring peace. It brought something far more dangerous. When the British surrendered and the cannons fell silent, Americans imagined the hardest part was over. They believed independence meant rest, prosperity, and moral clarity. But Henry Knox knew better. He had studied history too deeply to believe revolutions ended cleanly. Empires did not vanish. They transformed. And the young United States was already beginning to resemble the very force it had just defeated. Knox saw it first on the frontier. After the war, the Continental Army dissolved almost overnight. Soldiers went home unpaid. Officers sold their uniforms. The new government, drowning in debt, could barely keep the lights on, let alone defend its borders. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains stretched vast territories claimed by native nations who had lived there for generations. To many Americans, that land looked empty. To Knox, it looked like a powder keg. Settlers flooded westward anyway. They cut forests, burned villages, ignored treaties that barely existed on paper. Native resistance followed. Retaliation followed that. Violence escalated, small skirmishes turning into massacres. As Secretary of War, Henry Knox inherited the impossible task of managing this chaos. He wrote letters that few politicians wanted to read. He warned Congress again and again that the nation was walking toward moral disaster. Knox argued that native nations were sovereign peoples, not obstacles. He believed treaties must be honored. He feared that endless frontier violence would rot the republic from the inside. In private, he wrote something chilling. "If we cannot be just, we will never be safe." But justice was expensive. Land was profitable, and Knox was standing in the way of expansion. The pressure broke him slowly. Congress refused to fund a strong, disciplined army. They feared standing forces haunted by memories of British redcoats. But without an army, the frontier burned. Knox tried compromise. He proposed regulated expansion, negotiated boundaries, trade agreements. Each plan died in committee. Meanwhile, settlers continued killing and being killed. Then came the catastrophe. In 1791, an American force sent into the Northwest Territory marched directly into a coordinated native confederation. The result was the worst military defeat the United States would suffer at the hands of indigenous forces, over 600 American soldiers killed in a single day. It was a massacre. The nation panicked, and suddenly Henry Knox's warnings were no longer inconvenient. They were terrifyingly accurate. George Washington, now president, faced a brutal truth. Without a real army, the United States would collapse. Foreign powers watched closely. Britain still occupied forts. Spain eyed the Mississippi. Internal rebellion simmered. Washington turned, as he always had, to Knox. Together they built the first permanent American military force, not for glory, but survival. Knox designed its structure. Training, discipline, logistics. He believed professionalism could reduce chaos, prevent revenge killings, and impose order where rage had ruled. It was the birth of the U.S. Army. But it came too late to save his vision, because power changes the meaning of restraint. As the army grew stronger, political pressure grew louder. Settlers demanded protection. Land speculators demanded access. State governments demanded results. Treaties were signed and broken. Knox watched helplessly as agreements he helped draft were ignored the moment they became inconvenient. Military force replaced diplomacy. Villages burned not because they attacked, but because they existed where Americans wanted to settle. This was not the republic he imagined, while dragging cannons through snow. He had helped create the machine. Now it was running without him. By the mid-1790s, Henry Knox was exhausted. He resigned from office believing, perhaps foolishly, that civilian life might bring peace. Instead, it brought ruin. He invested in land, Western land, the same frontier that haunted his conscience. Speculation collapsed, debt piled up, lawsuits followed. The man who once controlled the artillery of a revolution could not control his own finances. Friends drifted away. Washington died. The new generation of leaders admired Knox, but did not listen to him. He grew heavier, sicker, more isolated, and history began forgetting him. His death was as unremarkable as his life had been extraordinary. In 1806, Henry Knox swallowed a chicken bone that tore his internal organs. Infection followed. There were no dramatic last words, no grand ceremony, just silence. The nation he helped save moved on, westward, violently, relentlessly, and yet his fingerprints remained everywhere. Every American military doctrine, every logistical campaign, every assumption that preparation wins wars before battles begin. Knox never wanted glory. He wanted stability. What he got instead was a warning etched into history, that even the men who save nations cannot save them from themselves. But here is the part few Americans are ever told. When later generations looked back, they celebrated Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton. They built monuments. They printed faces on currency. Henry Knox became a footnote. And that was convenient, because remembering him fully would mean confronting a harder truth, that America was not built only by speeches and ideals, but by invisible labor, brutal choices, and men who understood the cost long before others felt it. Henry Knox changed American history not by ruling it, but by preventing its collapse at the moment it was weakest, and then by watching, powerless, as the nation ignored the lessons he tried to teach. That is the tragedy, and that is the legacy. Long after Henry Knox was buried, long after his name slipped from common memory, his ideas kept marching forward, often without his consent, sometimes against everything he believed. This is the strange power of history. A man can lose control of his life, yet gain control of centuries. Knox never wrote a grand manifesto. He never sought to define America's destiny. But through discipline, logistics, and preparation, he taught the United States how to wage war before it understood what war would cost. And once a nation learns that lesson, it never unlearns it. In the early 19th century, America was still pretending it was not an empire. It spoke the language of liberty while expanding relentlessly. Presidents changed, flags multiplied, borders moved west like a living thing. The army, once feared as a threat to freedom, became a tool of inevitability. Officers trained using principles Knox had introduced decades earlier. Supply lines mattered more than courage. Organization mattered more than passion. Wars were no longer improvised. They were engineered. This mindset would carry the United States into conflicts Henry Knox never lived to see, but would have recognized instantly. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War. Each one echoed his belief that preparation decided outcomes long before the first shot. But there was a darker inheritance, too. Because Knox believed in control, and control in the wrong hands becomes domination. Nowhere was this more visible than in the wars against native nations. The early U.S. Army did not merely fight battles. It dismantled entire ways of life. Villages were targeted not as military threats, but as logistical ones: food sources, shelter, continuity. That logic traced directly back to European military theory Knox had studied so carefully. Starve the resistance, disrupt supply, break morale. Knox had once warned that such thinking, applied without restraint, would destroy the moral foundation of the Republic. He was right. By the time Andrew Jackson rose to power, the army Knox helped shape was no longer a shield. It was a hammer. And the frontier bled. Yet even as America expanded violently, it also stabilized. Trade flourished, cities grew, institutions hardened into permanence. That contradiction, brutality paired with order, became the American pattern. And Henry Knox sat quietly at its center, like a ghost no one acknowledged. Military academies adopted standardized training. Officers studied logistics as science. Artillery became precise, measured, devastating. Wars were no longer won by chance. They were managed. Then came the Civil War. More Americans died than in all previous U.S. wars combined. The scale was industrial. Railroads, factories, mass mobilization. This was not the war Knox imagined, but it was the war his philosophy made possible. Union generals spoke openly about supply chains, rail hubs, and economic targets. Sherman's march through the South was not chaos. It was calculated destruction. Break the system. End the war. Henry Knox would have understood the logic instantly. He might even have admired its efficiency. And he would have been horrified by its cost. After the Civil War, America changed forever. The army became permanent, professional, technological. The nation no longer feared standing forces. It relied on them. By the time the United States stepped onto the world stage in the 20th century, it did so with a confidence born of 2 centuries of preparation. World War I, World War II, Cold War. Across oceans and continents, American forces moved with precision, backed by logistics that dwarfed those of any rival. The secret was never just firepower. It was planning. That was Knox's gift, and his curse. By the late 20th century, Fort Knox no longer symbolized the man. It symbolized gold, security, power stored behind walls so thick no one dared test them. That irony would not have been lost on Henry Knox, a man who began life in poverty, who studied knowledge because he could not afford privilege, who believed strength existed to preserve order, not exploit weakness. His name now guarded wealth rather than wisdom. So why does his story matter now? Because modern America still struggles with the same tension Henry Knox saw at the beginning. How to be powerful without becoming cruel. How to be prepared without becoming paranoid. How to defend ideals without destroying them. Every drone strike planned months in advance. Every supply convoy crossing foreign land. Every war won on spreadsheets before it reaches the battlefield. All of it traces back to a bookseller who believed knowledge could save a nation. And sometimes did. Henry Knox never stood on a mountain and declared victory. He stood in snow and mud, counting ropes and oxen, making sure cannons moved 1 inch farther than anyone thought possible. He saved the American Revolution not with speeches, but with preparation. And then he spent the rest of his life watching as the nation learned only half his lesson. How to win, but not always why. The most astonishing truth is this. American history did not change because Henry Knox sought greatness. It changed because, at the most fragile moment imaginable, he refused to let everything fall apart. And sometimes that is enough to reshape the world. By the time America entered the modern age, Henry Knox had become something more powerful than a remembered man. He had become a pattern. The country no longer asked whether it should prepare for war. It asked only how early preparation should begin. Military planning became permanent, layered, and invisible, embedded into budgets, universities, factories, and politics. The United States did not wait for crises. It anticipated them. That instinct did not come from presidents or generals alone. It came from a foundational belief Henry Knox proved in the snow of 1775, that the side which prepares longest often fights shortest. In the 20th century, this belief hardened into doctrine. When World War II erupted, the United States transformed itself faster than any nation in history. Factories became arsenals, civilians became logistical nodes, entire cities were reorganized around supply chains and production quotas. This was not improvisation. It was institutional memory. American planners did not just think about battles. They thought about fuel, steel, transport, morale, replacement rates. concepts Knox had introduced when the nation was still an experiment. The war was won not only on beaches and in the air, but in warehouses, rail hubs, and assembly lines. Henry Knox would have recognized the victory. And he would have recognized the danger, because after World War II, America did not demobilize the way it once had. It stayed ready. The Cold War demanded constant preparation, missiles fueled, troops stationed, strategies updated endlessly for wars that might never happen. Power became permanent. Fear became structural. And the military no longer answered only to survival. It answered to influence. This was the moment Knox never lived to see and might not have survived witnessing. The logic of preparation had escaped its original purpose. In Vietnam, American planners calculated everything. Tonnage dropped, kill ratios, supply superiority. The numbers said the United States should win. Reality said otherwise. For the first time, America discovered that logistics could sustain a war indefinitely, but could not give it meaning. This was the failure Knox had warned about centuries earlier. Preparation without moral clarity does not prevent collapse. It only delays it. By the 21st century, the United States had become the most prepared military power in human history. Satellites watched the planet. Algorithms predicted conflict. Wars were modeled before they began. Decisions were made thousands of miles from consequences. And yet, despite all that preparation, confusion remained. Why fight? When to stop? What victory actually means? These questions haunted every modern conflict, and they traced back, quietly, to the unresolved tension Henry Knox carried to his grave. He believed order was necessary, but he also believed restraint was essential. America absorbed the first lesson completely. It never fully learned the second. Today, most Americans recognize the name Fort Knox, but almost none can tell you why it exists or who it honors. It has become shorthand for security, wealth, and impenetrability. But Henry Knox himself died unsecured, nearly forgotten, burdened by debt and regret. That contrast is not accidental. It is symbolic. The nation took his system, but left behind his conscience. Yet his story endures not because of monuments or textbooks, but because it explains something fundamental about America itself. The United States was not born powerful. It learned power. And the man who taught it how to prepare for survival also tried unsuccessfully to teach it how to live with that power afterward. There is a moment near the end of Knox's life, recorded by those who knew him, when he spoke quietly about the Revolution. He did not speak of victory. He spoke of responsibility. He wondered whether the nation would remember why it had fought, or only how. History answered him slowly. America became great. America became feared. America became prepared. And America is still searching for balance. That search began not in grand speeches or marble halls, but in frozen rivers, broken sleds, and a man who refused to accept collapse as inevitable. Henry Knox changed American history not by conquering it, but by holding it together long enough for everything else to happen. And that may be the most American legacy of all. In the end, Henry Knox did not fear death. He feared forgetting, not of his name, that never mattered much to him, but of the lesson his life tried to teach. He had seen empires rise and collapse on the pages of old books. He knew that nations rarely fail because they are weak. They fail because they forget why strength exists in the first place. As he aged, Knox spoke less about war and more about time. Time was the only enemy he never learned to plan for. The America he left behind was young, restless, and already addicted to motion. Roads pushed west, borders crept outward. Each generation believed expansion was destiny, not choice. Knox understood the truth most nations learn too late. Destiny is just momentum without reflection. He had once saved the revolution by slowing everything down, by stopping collapse long enough for reason to catch up. But after victory, America never slowed again. It accelerated. Long after his death, historians would argue about presidents, policies, and wars. They would debate morality and necessity. They would assign blame and praise. But beneath every argument lay a structure Henry Knox helped build. A belief that organization beats chaos, that preparation beats passion, that survival can be engineered. This belief became so natural that Americans stopped noticing it, which is why they stopped noticing him. When future officers studied logistics, they were not taught his name. When armies planned supply lines across oceans, they did not speak of Boston booksellers or frozen rivers, but they repeated his logic instinctively. That is how deeply he changed history. Not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. There is a cruel irony to how America remembers its founders. Those who spoke best are remembered most. Those who work quietly are absorbed into the system they created. Henry Knox belongs to the second group. Without him, speeches would have meant nothing. Declarations would have died in winter. Ideals would have frozen before spring. He gave the revolution time. Time is the most expensive gift in history. Today, when Americans speak of national security, readiness, or military power, they are unknowingly speaking Henry Knox's language. When they argue over wars fought far from home, they are wrestling with the consequences of lessons learned too well and warnings not learned enough. The United States became strong because it prepared. It struggles because it still asks how, but not always why. That question haunted Henry Knox. It still should. His life proved something unsettling. That one man without rank, wealth, or pedigree can change the course of history simply by refusing to let failure be final, and that even such a man cannot control what the future does with the tools he creates. Henry Knox never ruled America. He never defined it. But when the nation stood on the edge of collapse, cold, starving, leaderless, he held it together with knowledge, stubbornness, and faith that preparation could buy hope one more day. Everything else came later. And if there is a final truth his story leaves behind, it is this: America did not survive because it was destined to. It survived because once, in the dead of winter, an ordinary man refused to believe the story was already over. That refusal became history, and history never really moved on.